She saw his eyes, stripped bare of all honor and duty, fixed only on her dying sister as the girl crumpled to the ballroom floor. In that instant, Catherine knew her opulent engagement was a death sentence, and that she had to break the contract and become the villain to save the life of the woman her fiancé truly loved. The next morning she delivered the forged letter, taking all the social ruin onto herself. But the terrifying gamble was, would her honorable ex-fiancé finally be brave enough to choose forbidden love over the debt he owed her? If you're ready to enjoy this story, click that subscribe button, like this video, and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more wonderful stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get into the story. The Moorland Estate, 1810. The golden light of a late summer afternoon lay thick and deceptively peaceful across the manicured grounds of the Moorland Estate. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and the final sweet bloom of garden roses, creating an atmosphere of perfect, gilded propriety. Lydia Moorland, a gentle figure of 21, stood motionless on the long, symmetrical lawn path leading up to the grand manor house. Her gown, a luxurious composition of soft peach and tiered white petticoats, seemed too heavy for her slender frame, but her attention was fixed not on the fabric, but on the earth beneath her feet. She looked precisely as a daughter of her station should, demure, elegant, and positioned as a picturesque accessory to the family's wealth and standing. Yet, in the way she clutched the skirt of her dress, her fingers tight against the rich fabric, one could sense a profound hidden distress. She was here on a duty, to ensure the garden was prepared for the grand engagement party, a mere 7 days away, that would celebrate the advantageous match between her older sister Catherine and the esteemed Jonathan Keaton. Every detail of the event, from the placement of the wrought iron lanterns to the path where the honored guests would promenade, was meant to confirm the flawless success of the Moorland family's planning. Lydia's presence was part of that perfection, the sweet, quiet sister supporting the main event. Just 7 days until they are truly bound, she thought, the simple calculation causing a dizzying weight to press upon her chest. The approaching reality was a deadline for her own slow, silent destruction. She watched a figure emerge from the shadow of the house and begin walking down the path toward her. It was Jonathan Keaton. He was everything a man of honor should be: tall, composed, and carrying an air of quiet, serious intelligence. He treated Catherine with deep respect, their conversations formal and appropriate. Yet when his gaze found Lydia, it often lingered a fraction too long, reserved but undeniably kind. His smile, though formal, was the single most beautiful light in her world. The garden path was perfect, the sun was golden. The man walking toward her, smiling a reserved, kind smile, was the perfect fiancé. But he was not hers, and the thought, though forbidden, was slowly breaking Lydia's heart. It was a love that was consuming her, fueling a deep, exhausting guilt that had begun to manifest as trembling hands, sleepless nights, and the occasional terrifying dizziness that only she seemed to notice. She knew, with chilling certainty, that the day of her sister's wedding would be the day she broke completely. Before she could master her breathing or summon a polite curtsy, a call interrupted the moment, sharp and decisive, tearing through the quiet elegance of the garden. "Lydia! Lydia, child!" It was Evelyn Moorland, her mother, standing rigid on the terrace, a symbol of the uncompromising tradition and duty that ruled their lives. "The trousseau. Lady Hemlock's seamstress requires immediate assistance with the fitting, and Catherine is otherwise engaged. Come at once." The command forced Lydia back to her role. She dropped the handful of skirt she was clenching, smoothing the fabric down as she attempted to compose her features into an expression of serene compliance. She lifted her head and began the difficult walk toward the house, her path intersecting directly with Jonathan's. She could not speak to him, not now, not while the knowledge of her secret treason felt physically etched upon her face. She managed only a slight nod of acknowledgement, the shame of her feelings forcing her to look down at her shoes as she passed him. The fleeting moment of their proximity, the sight of his perfectly tied cravat, the subtle, clean scent of his coat, was almost too much to bear. She hurried on, eager to leave the garden and hide her sickness behind the walls of the house, retreating from the man who was meant to be her happiness and who would, instead, be her ruin. The dining room at the Moreland estate was all polished mahogany and shimmering crystal, a silent testament to the family's impeccable taste and thriving status. It was the gilded cage of Lydia's existence. Tonight's gathering was small, only the immediate family and Jonathan Keaton, but the formality was palpable, enforced by the rigid presence of Evelyn Moreland at the head of the table. Jonathan was seated to Evelyn's right, and Catherine, radiant and poised, was to his right. Lydia, the younger and less socially significant daughter, was positioned across the wide table, giving her a clear, unobstructed view of the couple who were soon to merge their lives, and her own secret heartache. She tried, as always, to be invisible. She took small, measured bites of the roasted lamb, focusing intensely on the silver pattern of her fork. She rehearsed simple, bland phrases in her mind. Yes, the weather is delightful, or a most interesting play, prepared to deploy them instantly should her mother or father demand she contribute to the conversation. Every breath was a conscious effort to keep the tremors in her hands from reaching her glass of water. Her deep flaw, her tendency toward emotional repression, was not a shield here. It was a tightening chain. Catherine was speaking, her voice calm and strong, describing their recent visit to an art gallery in London. She was naturally eloquent, her delivery confident, and Lydia admired her fiercely. Catherine had always handled the social obligations with effortless grace, shouldering the weight of the family's expectations without complaint. It was for Catherine's sake, Lydia reminded herself fiercely, that this treacherous love must remain buried deeper than the foundation stones of the house. Jonathan listened with the composed attention that defined his honor. He responded intelligently, offering a concise critique of a specific painter's use of chiaroscuro. Their conversation was a smooth, respectable intellectual ballet, exactly the foundation their alliance, which Evelyn called a marriage, was built upon. Then, during a brief lull, the footman attempted to serve Jonathan the burgundy, and, in a slight stumble, nearly tilted the heavy decanter. Evelyn let out a tiny, sharp gasp of social horror. Catherine, trained since birth to manage crises of decorum, merely raised an eyebrow and prepared a calming, dismissive statement. But it was Lydia who acted first. Before the footman could panic or Evelyn could launch a verbal assault, Lydia, without a word, pushed her own water glass forward an inch, creating a subtle barrier and diverting the man's attention just enough to allow him to steady the decanter and recover. It was a gentle, intuitive act of kindness, requiring no speech. Jonathan saw it. He saw the quiet intelligence behind the move, the immediate compassionate instinct to protect the powerless footman. He did not thank her publicly. He simply waited until the footman had retreated, and Evelyn had begun a new, safe topic about the coming season. Then Jonathan's eyes lifted, traveling across the linen and silver, meeting Lydia's gaze. His formality was utterly gone. His expression held a flash of recognition, a silent acknowledgement of their shared observation, and a profound, genuine thank you. It was a fleeting, unguarded moment of true connection, a complicity that lasted no more than a second, but felt to Lydia like a lifetime. Her heart hammered against her ribs, the guilt and the thrill a dizzying cocktail. She immediately looked down, flushing crimson, terrified that the sheer force of the emotion would spill out across the pristine tablecloth. But the moment had been seen. Catherine had been watching her fiancé. She was accustomed to the respectful, slightly distant warmth he usually displayed. But the look he had just given Lydia was something different. A look of unintentional favoritism, a spark of true mutual understanding that bypassed the superficial courtesy of the table. It was the look of one who truly saw another. Catherine watched Lydia withdraw, her younger sister's habitual gesture of defense. Lydia was gentle, dreamy, and too fragile for the harsh realities of their world. She had been pale for weeks, a quiet shadow moving through the house, and the family had dismissed it as nerves over the impending wedding chaos. But Catherine was acutely aware of Lydia's capacity for deep, consuming feeling, and she knew a nervous tremor was distinct from the crushing weight of heartbreak. A cold, precise dread settled in Catherine's stomach. She recognized the undeniable truth reflected in that shared glance. Jonathan was honorable, and he was trying desperately to fulfill his duty to Catherine, but his heart, unknowingly, lingered with her sister. And Lydia, the quietly intelligent soul who suffered in silence, was dying of the guilt and the beautiful agony of the forbidden love they shared. Catherine kept her chin high, nodding serenely as Evelyn droned on about a new bonnet maker. But inside, the strong-willed sister was already preparing for a battle that would require the sacrifice of her own future. Lydia's private chamber was the only place in the vast estate where the gilded cage felt less suffocating. Here, in the dim glow of a single lamp, she did not have to hold her posture, or rehearse bland phrases, or pretend that her heart was not tearing itself apart with every passing day. The fleeting exchange with Jonathan at the dinner table, that silent, shared acknowledgement of her kindness to the footman, had been a devastating confirmation, sealing the depth of the feeling she was meant to bury. It was the knowledge that he saw her, truly saw the quiet core of her, which made the treason so much sweeter, and the guilt so much heavier. Sleep had become an enemy. The moment her head touched the pillow, the room filled with the accusing silence of her own mind. She would lie awake for hours, tracing the lines of the wallpaper in the moonlight, wrestling with the shameful truth. She was failing her sister. She was a serpent in the garden, harboring a wicked desire beneath a facade of gentle resignation. The effort of silence was exhausting, chipping away at her fragile constitution, until her pallor was alarming, and her soft, hesitant walk was marked by a new, almost invisible fragility. Evelyn, her mother, noticed the paleness, of course, but dismissed it with chilling efficiency. "It is the excitement of Catherine's match, Lydia. Your nerves are overwrought. A teaspoon of tincture before bed, and mind you don't fret in front of the guests." Thomas, her father, noticed with a sadder, quieter awareness, but as always, he left the management of emotional affairs to his wife, retreating behind the safety of his newspapers. Only Mrs. Davies, Lydia's personal maid, who had served her since childhood, saw the truth behind the strained smiles and the sudden, shallow catches of breath. Mrs. Davies was a small, quiet woman with eyes that had seen everything and judged nothing. She was the single trusted vessel for Lydia's agony. One night, 2 days after the dinner, Lydia woke with a suffocating tightness in her chest, the familiar panic seizing her. She rang the bell for Mrs. Davies, not for assistance with her clothes, but simply for the comfort of another presence. Mrs. Davies came immediately, not in a flurry of concern, but with a simple, quiet efficiency that Lydia treasured. She lit another candle, stirred the fire, and silently offered Lydia a cup of warm, weak tea. "Are you quite cold, my lady?" Mrs. Davies asked, her voice low, a soft rasp that barely disturbed the stillness. Lydia shook her head, clutching the warm china cup. "It is not the cold, Davies. It is the weight." She didn't have to explain further. Davies knew the burdens of the estate, the pressures of society, but she also knew the weight of a heart that was actively fighting its own nature. "I am a wicked failure, Davies," Lydia whispered, her voice cracking. She had to speak, or the guilt would consume her entirely. "I am so steeped in sin that I do not know how I may face my sister at the altar. I should be brimming with joy for her, with nothing but selfless love. But instead—" She stopped, unable to name Jonathan. The truth was too dangerous, too painful to articulate aloud. Even the walls felt like they possessed ears that might carry the betrayal to Catherine. Mrs. Davies sat beside her on the edge of the bed, her face shadowed by the candlelight. "We do not choose what the heart decides to yearn for, Lady Lydia. The heart simply is. It is what we choose to do with that yearning that defines us." "But I have chosen nothing. That is the sin. I have done nothing but exist." "And yet my very existence pollutes the purity of Catherine's match," Lydia insisted, a tear finally tracking a desperate path down her pale cheek. "I wish I could simply choose to be blank, to be happy, to be good. But I cannot, and the cost, it is stripping the very life from me. I feel as though I am wasting away from the inside." Davies took her hand, her touch surprisingly firm. "You are not wicked, my lady. You are merely human, bearing a love too grand for the small box society has built for you. You have chosen duty, always. That choice is what is making you ill. You are sacrificing yourself, and that is not failure. It is simply too heavy for one young soul to carry alone." The maid's simple, unburdened definition, not wicked, merely human, offered a sliver of relief, enough air for Lydia to take a deeper, less panicked breath. But as she watched the candle flame tremble, she knew the confession had not solved her problem. It had only delayed the inevitable consequence. The clock was still ticking toward the wedding, and the secret, even partially spoken, remained an executioner's blade poised above her. The library was the only room in the Moorland estate that offered a true respite from the anxious hum of wedding preparations. It smelled of aged leather, ink, and dust motes dancing in the narrow beams of sunlight, a quiet, cool sanctuary where the rules of social performance did not apply. Lydia had retreated there mid-morning, claiming a headache to escape a grueling session of silver polishing. She settled into a window seat, partially hidden by a curtain of heavy velvet, clutching a worn copy of a philosopher's treatise on ethical duty. She was attempting to read, to find solace in the absolute rigidity of moral codes, hoping to discipline her unruly heart. But the words blurred, reflecting her inner turmoil. How does one choose duty when that duty feels like a slow act of suicide? She had been there perhaps half an hour when the door creaked softly, and a shadow fell across the carpet. She froze, clutching the book to her chest like a shield. It was Jonathan. He looked weary, his usually impeccable composure slightly frayed, suggesting he, too, had sought refuge from the domestic whirlwind. He did not immediately see her in the curtained alcove. He walked directly to a high shelf dedicated to Roman history, pulling down a volume with the focused intensity of a man seeking escape. He leaned against the shelves, opened the book, and began to read, his presence filling the room with a quiet, solid strength that was both comforting and acutely painful to Lydia. After several minutes of suspended silence, Jonathan finally lifted his head, his eyes scanning the room, and then he saw her. His reserved expression softened immediately, transforming into the genuine, unguarded kindness that always stole her breath. "Lydia," he murmured, his voice low, as if respecting the solemnity of the room. "I beg your pardon. I did not realize I was intruding." "Not at all, Mr. Keaton," she managed, her voice a hesitant breath. I was merely hiding from the linens. He smiled, a true small smile that reached his eyes. A noble pursuit. I believe I am hiding from the seating charts, which are a far more treacherous enemy. He saw the book resting in her lap. Ah, Kant. A rather serious choice for a summer morning's respite. Are you finding illumination there, or further complexity? Complexity, I fear, Lydia admitted, finding a strange courage in his open curiosity. I was reading his argument on the unconditional nature of duty. I find myself wondering if duty can ever truly conflict with basic human well-being. Jonathan pushed off the shelf and approached her alcove slowly, respectfully. He did not sit, but stood close enough that she could see the dark sincerity in his eyes. An excellent question, Miss Morland, he said, his tone entirely intellectual, yet the shared subject matter felt deeply, dangerously personal. I believe true duty is not merely following rules set by others, but honoring the profound truth within oneself. If the prescribed duty harms the soul, perhaps the greater ethical imperative is to be honest, even if that honesty causes rupture. He paused, looking not at her, but at the spine of a book near her head, lost in thought. I spend much time debating this very thing, trying to live by a code, yet feeling the constant pull of what is genuine. Sometimes the most honorable path is the most difficult to take, because it asks you to defy everything you have been taught. Lydia met his gaze, suddenly fearless because she knew he was not speaking of her love, but of his own inner struggle with the arranged match. He feels it too. The thought screamed through her veins. He understood the agonizing choice between the social ought and the personal is. In that shared, silent understanding of the burden of their roles, their deep affinity, their shared language, was confirmed, a bond far stronger than any formal engagement. Neither of them noticed the slight shift in the light near the heavy oak door. Catherine Morland had come to the library seeking Jonathan, intending to discuss the logistics of the forthcoming marriage settlements. She stood perfectly still, unannounced, her hand still resting on the cool metal of the doorknob. She saw the intensity of their connection. Lydia pale but utterly absorbed, Jonathan serious but entirely unguarded, his reserved demeanor stripped away by a conversation that was meant for two people alone. It was not a glance. It was a sustained intellectual and spiritual embrace. Catherine didn't need to hear the words to understand. She saw the profound relief in Lydia's eyes at finally being understood, and the reciprocal, quiet yearning in Jonathan's face, a yearning he clearly fought to deny. She saw the truth her parents and society had ignored. They were twin souls, connected by a depth that she, his intended bride, could never touch. A fierce, protective pain shot through Catherine's chest, sharper than any betrayal. It was not anger at Jonathan or jealousy of Lydia. It was the realization of the absolute devastation awaiting her sister. If this love was allowed to be buried under the wedding vows, it would not merely cause heartbreak. It would extinguish Lydia entirely. Catherine silently withdrew her hand, easing the door shut without a sound. She walked away from the library, her steps firm on the polished hall floor. The sight she had witnessed was not the inciting incident for their courtship. It was the inciting incident for her sacrifice. The time for gentle observation was over. The time for action, drastic, immediate, and utterly selfless, had begun. Catherine's movements were outwardly identical to every other day, controlled, purposeful, and elegant. She went to her fittings, dictated instructions to the household staff, and wrote letters concerning the wedding gifts. But internally, She had shifted entirely. The woman who had left the library after witnessing the quiet, dangerous affinity between her sister and her fiancé was now a watchful sentinel, a protective elder sibling who understood that the game of social duty had become a high-stakes, life-or-death negotiation. She had no anger for Jonathan. His honor, his desire to do the right thing, was what made him attractive, and it was that very honor that was trapping him. He was a man drowning in prescribed expectations, and she had no resentment toward Lydia. How could she, when she saw the truth of Lydia's fragility and the immense weight of the guilt consuming her? Lydia was fading, literally being extinguished by a love she refused to acknowledge. For 2 days, Catherine watched. She noticed how Jonathan, when speaking to Catherine about mundane plans, would involuntarily glance toward the door if Lydia was not present, a small, subtle seeking for the intellectual comfort she provided. She noticed how Lydia, still pale, would stand slightly apart during afternoon tea, avoiding eye contact with Jonathan, but her entire posture was oriented toward him, like a flower perpetually turning to the sun. The vigilance settled Catherine's resolve. This was a truth she could not present to her mother, who would deem it a ridiculous romantic fantasy that threatened their carefully constructed alliance. This was a truth that required a quiet, direct intervention. She found Jonathan alone in the study late one evening, ostensibly reviewing the tenant farm accounts. The room was dark, save for the single lamp on his desk. She closed the door behind her with a quiet click, approaching him with the calm demeanor he was accustomed to. "Jonathan," she began, her voice low and even, immediately dispensing with any preamble about the accounts. "I hope you will forgive my directness, but I must ask you a question that is, perhaps, quite sensitive." He looked up, surprised by the gravity of her tone. He stood immediately, offering her his seat, but she declined with a shake of her head. "You know, Jonathan, that my parents value this union highly. We are well suited in temperament and in station. I have every confidence that we will execute a respectable, successful marriage." She paused, allowing the weight of their accepted narrative to settle between them. "But an arrangement can only be successful if both parties enter it with a whole heart, and not merely a resolute will." His composure tightened slightly. "Catherine, I assure you my will is entirely resolute. I honor my word, and I look forward to our shared future." "I know you do, Jonathan," she said softly. "You are the most honorable man I know. But resolve and affection are distinct entities." She leaned slightly closer, keeping her voice barely above a whisper. "Jonathan, are you entering this marriage because it is the right thing to do? Or because you would be genuinely unhappy if you did not?" He hesitated, a long, agonizing beat of silence during which his eyes dropped momentarily to the parchment on his desk. He was a man who spoke formally, almost stiffly, when his feelings overwhelmed him, and now his answer came out measured and defensive. "My dear Catherine, I am aware that marriages of our class are not predicated on the fleeting passions of youth. We share respect, mutual interests, and a deep regard for duty. That is a foundation far more enduring than mere happiness." He met her gaze, his own eyes showing a quiet, profound conflict. "I am entirely committed to you, and to the life we are building." He was speaking of duty. He spoke of respect. He spoke of commitment and shared interests. But he did not speak of love, or genuine desire, or the profound happiness of waking beside her every day. He spoke stiffly, retreating behind the fortress of his honor. Catherine observed the evasion, and it was confirmation enough. He was committed to her as an idea, as a contract, not as the woman who held his heart. He was denying his own truth, sacrificing his emotional self to the code he lived by. She nodded slowly, her expression softening into a deep, sad understanding. "Thank you for your honesty, Jonathan. It is a painful distinction you have drawn, but I understand it perfectly." She did not press the matter of Lydia, knowing that to name her would be to compromise Lydia's fragile sense of propriety and throw Jonathan's honor into ruin. She had what she needed. She saw his evasion, she saw his internal struggle with duty, and she had already seen the light in his eyes when he looked at her sister. "I only wish you peace, Jonathan," she concluded, and then she turned, leaving him alone in the lamplight with his accounts and his profound, unacknowledged misery. As she walked back to her own room, she knew the truth. Her fiancé's heart belonged unknowingly and honorably to her sister. She now carried not only the knowledge of Lydia's distress, but the certain conviction that the only way to save her sister's life was to destroy her own engagement. The plan, hatched in the shadows of the library, was now concrete. The day of the engagement tea was a triumph of social engineering meticulously managed by Evelyn Morland. It was a smaller, more intimate affair than the ball, designed to impress key family alliances with the sheer perfection of the match. For Evelyn, this was the final rehearsal before the main performance, and every participant had to be flawless. Lydia was, of course, required to attend. "You will wear the pale blue silk, Lydia," Evelyn commanded that morning, inspecting her youngest daughter with a critical eye. "And you will attempt to bring some color back into your cheeks. You look entirely too wan, and it reflects poorly on the atmosphere of celebration. Smile, child. Your sister is making an excellent connection. Do not allow your nerves to overshadow her happiness." Lydia made a strenuous effort to comply. She endured Mrs. Davies's attempts to pinch color into her skin and arranged her expression into one of quiet, dutiful pleasure. She entered the drawing room, where the air was thick with the scent of lilies and the sharp, bright chatter of society women. She avoided Jonathan completely, placing herself strategically next to Father Thomas Morland, whose practical, mild-tempered presence offered a small refuge. Thomas, observing her strained smile and the dark shadows beneath her eyes, offered her a silent, sympathetic pat on the wrist, a gesture of awareness he never dared to translate into action. The atmosphere of imposed joy was suffocating. Every mention of Catherine and Jonathan's future, every admiring compliment about the excellence of the arrangement, felt like a deliberate blow to her fragile composure. She listened to a dowager countess detail the precise size of the diamond Jonathan had gifted Catherine, and Lydia could only hear the crushing finality of the transaction. She was trapped in the center of the celebration of her own deepest agony. When a particularly sharp-tongued aunt began praising Catherine's steadfast constitution, subtly contrasting it with Lydia's dreamy fragility, Lydia felt the familiar, terrifying rush of blood drain from her head. The room, with its sparkling crystal and perfectly dressed guests, began to spin, the faces melting into blurred shapes of accusation and joy. She tried to grip the back of her father's chair, but her hand was slick with cold perspiration. The noise of the room turned into a distant roar, and the floor seemed to tilt violently. She took one faltering step back, searching desperately for the exit, but the movement was too abrupt. Her vision swam into a gray haze, and her legs gave way. She did not fall completely. A strong, calm hand wrapped around her elbow, steadying her instantly. It was Catherine. "My apologies, Father," Catherine said smoothly, her voice betraying none of the alarm she felt. She spoke just loud enough to cover the slight commotion, drawing the focus only to her own competence. "Lydia has been assisting the staff tirelessly for the past few days. I believe the heat of the room is simply too much. I shall escort her upstairs immediately." Before anyone, least of all Evelyn, could object to the disruption, Catherine had propelled Lydia discreetly toward the rear doors. The moment they were out in the cool, silent hallway, Catherine allowed her composure to drop just enough to reveal her fierce concern. "Lydia, lean on me," Catherine commanded, her strong arm supporting most of her sister's weight. Lydia was gasping, leaning against the cold stone of the wall, fighting the wave of nausea and weakness. I am sorry. I did not mean to cause trouble. Her voice was barely a whisper, thin and ragged. Hush. Do not speak of trouble, Catherine said, pushing her sister gently toward the staircase. In Catherine's private room, away from the demanding eyes of society, she lowered Lydia carefully onto a velvet chaise lounge. She dismissed her own maid and quickly brought a basin of cool water and a clean cloth. Catherine knelt by the chaise, the scent of her own expensive perfume mingling with the coldness of the water she dabbed on Lydia's forehead. This was no faintness from lack of air, Catherine knew. This was not the melodrama of nerves that Evelyn believed in. She watched the stark, terrible pallor of Lydia's skin, the faint blue shadows beneath her eyes, and the way her heart fluttered with a weak, frantic rhythm beneath the pale silk. This was the consequence of the emotional repression, the ultimate payment for the guilt. Lydia's spirit, crushed under the weight of her forbidden love, was physically failing her. Catherine did not ask questions. She did not need confirmation of the love, or the guilt, or the terror. She needed only to look at the fragile state of the body before her to understand the stark, brutal medical truth. Lydia was not suffering from nerves. She was dying of a broken heart. The sight of her beloved sister so near collapse galvanized Catherine entirely. Her resolve, which had been set in the library days before, hardened into steel. The time for caution was over. There was no gentle path forward. She would sacrifice everything, her match, her standing, her future happiness, to save this life. She gently smoothed the hair from Lydia's damp forehead. I will not let you break. Lydia slept soundly for the first time in weeks, utterly exhausted from the dizzying collapse. Catherine sat in her own room, a single candle burning low, illuminating the heavy mahogany desk where her mother usually conducted family affairs. The sound of the engagement tea guests departing, the muffled carriage wheels and distant farewells, had faded into the deep silence of the evening. Catherine had spent the hours after Lydia's collapse sitting by her sister's bedside, confirming the terrible fragility of her health. She watched the shallow breaths, the slight rapid tremor in Lydia's hands even in sleep, and she knew. This was not a plea for attention. This was the spirit struggling to remain tethered to the body. If the wedding proceeded, Lydia would not survive the year. The choice, for Catherine, was no choice at all. Her own happiness, the high social standing of the marriage, the approval of her parents, all of it paled to irrelevance against the threat of losing her sister. She pulled a sheet of high-quality parchment toward her, dipped her pen, and began to formulate the plan. She understood the severity of the action she was about to take. To break an engagement of this caliber, one so meticulously arranged and publicly celebrated, was not merely a disappointment. It was an act of social dishonor that would cling to her reputation for years, threatening the family's standing. Evelyn would be incandescent with fury, and society would gossip with gleeful malice. But the plan had to be designed to protect Lydia entirely. If Catherine simply declared that Jonathan did not truly love her, or worse, that he had feelings for Lydia, it would instantly turn Lydia into a social pariah, the treacherous sister, the interloper who ruined a respected match. The ensuing guilt and shame would undoubtedly finish what the repression had started. No. The dishonor had to be hers alone, and the reason had to be unassailable, even if utterly false. It had to be a flaw, or a sudden irresistible change on Catherine's part that exonerated Jonathan completely and left Lydia untouched by suspicion. She chewed the end of her quill, her mind racing through possibilities. A prior, hidden affair. Too scandalous. A sudden religious calling. Too dramatic and easily dismissed by Evelyn. She settled on the simplest, most devastating social lie. A secret, sudden, and irresistible romantic attachment to another. She began drafting the letter to Jonathan, choosing her words with the precision of a surgeon. She started by reinforcing his honor, ensuring he knew her decision was entirely independent of his character. My dear Jonathan, it is with a profound sense of duty, a duty I owe to my future happiness and, more critically, to your own peace, that I must end our alliance. You are a man of impeccable integrity, and I could ask for no finer husband in the eyes of the world. However, a truth has revealed itself to me recently, one that I can no longer deny, which makes this marriage impossible. She paused, reading the words again. Good. It made the decision hers. Now the lie. It had to be an outside force, a sudden emotional torrent that even a composed woman like herself could not resist. I have, rather foolishly and entirely without your fault, discovered a genuine and overwhelming affection for another gentleman. He is a distant acquaintance, a scholar of the arts, quite unsuitable for my current position, and a man I had intended to forget. But his presence, though distant, has rendered my commitment to you entirely dishonest. To marry you now, with my heart so recently and irrevocably claimed by another, would be a profound act of disrespect to your honor. The details were intentionally vague, a scholar, distant, unsuitable, details that would infuriate Evelyn and give the gossips something to chew on without offering any concrete evidence to refute. It painted Catherine as rash, perhaps momentarily mad, but ultimately the cause of the rupture. She wrote a final passage, a cryptic instruction meant only for him, referencing the conversation she had witnessed in the library. Please know, Jonathan, that my greatest comfort in this painful decision is the hope that you find not just peace but true happiness. Sometimes the duty to truth requires defying the world's expectations. You know of what I speak. I trust you implicitly to know how to honor this painful gift. She signed it, the single stroke of her pen severing the future that had been so carefully planned for 6 months. She sealed the letter, the paper feeling heavy and final in her hand. It was an act of social suicide, yes, but it was the only way to save a life. The letter to Jonathan was the first step. The second, more treacherous task would be facing Evelyn's wrath and making the break public, a performance Catherine intended to execute with the same calm resolution she had used to craft the lie. She placed the letter where her personal footman would collect it first thing in the morning. The cage was about to be shattered. The engagement ball was not a mere party. It was a dazzling, merciless spectacle. The Moreland ballroom was a blinding wash of light, music, and the rustle of hundreds of silk gowns, designed to solidify the union of Catherine and Jonathan with overwhelming public approval. Evelyn had triumphed. The room pulsed with the confirmation of her family's social success. Lydia was dressed in a simple white muslin, a deliberate contrast to Catherine's radiant emerald silk. She was barely strong enough to stand, her recent collapse having left her weakened and terrified. Her mother had permitted no excuses, dressing her instead with the stern command, "You will appear, Lydia. You will smile for 3 hours. And then you may retire. Do your duty." She stood near the edge of the ballroom, a small, pale fixture in the overwhelming tide of color and noise. The air was too thick, the music too loud, and the knowledge of the sealed letter that Catherine had dispatched that morning, a letter Lydia knew nothing about, only added a terrible layer of foreboding to the atmosphere. Her eyes were drawn relentlessly to the center of the room, where Catherine and Jonathan were performing the dance of the evening. They were flawless. Catherine moved with a stately, confident grace, her smile poised and captivating. Jonathan was a handsome counterpoint, his form disciplined and strong, his attention entirely fixed on his partner. Lydia watched them, and the accumulated guilt and self-loathing reached its crescendo. It was not mere jealousy that overwhelmed her. It was the horrifying conviction that her love for Jonathan was a dark, selfish stain on her sister's genuine, beautiful happiness. She saw the perfection of their duty and felt the ugliness of her own forbidden desire. She does not deserve this burden, this secret I carry, Lydia thought, the thought vibrating through her like a painful fever. The music swelled, and Jonathan executed a turn that brought him momentarily facing Lydia. His expression, even in the midst of the performance, flickered toward her, not with the intimate warmth of the library, but with a brief, concerned scrutiny of her obvious pallor. It was an instant of recognition, a silent question about her welfare. That fleeting concern was the final, devastating weight. It was the confirmation that he cared, that he saw her suffering, and that his very presence was tearing her apart. The world spun faster. The music became a shrieking siren in her ears, and the hundreds of guests dissolved into a single, overwhelming blur of noise. The repression, the duty, the guilt, the entire edifice of her resistance snapped. Lydia reached out blindly for the nearest column, missed, and crumpled silently to the polished floor. The music did not stop instantly, but a ripple of horrified silence began at the edge of the room where she fell. Catherine, finishing a sequence of the dance, was one of the first to see the small, crumpled shape of her sister on the edge of the dance floor. Catherine reacted with the swiftness of pure shock, but she was not the fastest. Jonathan was. Before the polite social circle could even form, before Evelyn could organize her horrified outrage, Jonathan abandoned the dance entirely. His face, usually a mask of reserved composure, was stripped bare. He moved like a projectile, bypassing the etiquette of the entire room, leaving Catherine standing alone as he sprinted toward the fallen figure. Catherine saw the horror in his eyes as he dropped to his knees beside Lydia. It was not the dismay of a man seeing a disruption of his engagement ball or the appropriate concern for a future sister-in-law. It was the raw, primal terror of a man fearing for the life of the woman he loves. In that unguarded, desperate rush, Catherine saw the truth of his heart laid bare, just as she had seen the truth of Lydia's fragility. She watched him lift Lydia's head and whisper a frantic, unintelligible question, his fine waistcoat brushing the floor, all thoughts of decorum utterly forgotten. The emotional climax had been reached. Lydia's body had finally given voice to her heart's impossible truth, and Jonathan's reaction had finally laid bare his own. Catherine stood straight, the emerald silk gown now feeling like the armor of a warrior. She took a deep, steadying breath. It is done, she thought. The lie is over. Now the sacrifice begins. The social disaster was irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was the life he feared losing. The morning after the ball was thick with a tense, oppressive silence. Lydia was upstairs, safely in the care of Mrs. Davies, weak but recovering. The chaos of her collapse had been swiftly contained, but the social damage and the clear, desperate terror in Jonathan's reaction could not be undone. Catherine summoned Jonathan and her parents to the east parlour. Evelyn, still reeling from the public scandal of Lydia's faint, had prepared a lecture on duty and composure, but the moment Catherine entered the room, Evelyn knew her fury would be better spent elsewhere. Catherine's bearing was utterly serene, her composure absolute, and her voice, when she spoke, was calm, precise, and entirely devoid of emotion. "Mother, Father, Jonathan," she began, standing before the cold fireplace, "I have called you here to inform you that I have broken my engagement to Mr. Keaton. The necessary correspondence was delivered to him this morning." The silence that followed was so profound it felt like a physical shockwave. Thomas, her father, merely paled and looked at the carpet, unable to meet her eyes. Evelyn, however, found her voice instantly rising from her chair with a high, dangerous pitch of disbelief. "Catherine, you will not utter such madness! What correspondence? You are to be married. You have ruined the entire family's standing with your sister's dramatics, and now you propose this theatrical stupidity? Evelyn advanced on her daughter, her face scarlet with incandescent wrath. You will recall that letter immediately. This match secures your future and ours. Catherine did not retreat an inch. She met her mother's fury with an unnerving tranquility. The decision is finalized, Mother. It is not open to debate. I have realized, quite recently, that I cannot proceed with this marriage. I am unwilling to enter a commitment of this gravity when my heart is fixed on another gentleman. The lie, already crafted, tumbled out flawlessly, delivered with the calm resolution of a woman describing the weather. Another gentleman? Evelyn sputtered, stumbling backward. What other gentleman? There is no other gentleman. Who is he? Where did you meet him? This is an invention. He is a distant acquaintance, Mother, entirely unsuitable for polite society, and my attachment to him is foolish, but it is real, Catherine stated, the falsehood now a part of her armor. I cannot dishonor Jonathan by pretending otherwise. My choice is final. The responsibility for the breach is entirely mine. This tactic, taking the full measure of the shame onto herself, was devastatingly effective. It cut off Evelyn's arguments, which were based on propriety and logic. If Catherine admitted to a romantic recklessness, no amount of parental fury could force her to the altar. The match was irrevocably tainted by her supposed weakness. All the while, Jonathan Keaton stood motionless by the window. He had already read the letter, his mind still reeling from the shock of the beautiful, articulate lie it contained. He knew Catherine was not a woman given to rash, secret attachments. He looked from Catherine's unshakable resolve to the memory of Lydia's collapse, and the pieces finally clicked into painful place. He had seen the terror in his own heart the night before, and he knew Catherine had seen it too. Evelyn, defeated by her daughter's composure, dissolved into frustrated, dramatic sobs. You have ruined us, Catherine. Ruined! Catherine waited for the outburst to subside, then turned to Jonathan, signaling him with a slight incline of her head toward the door. Mr. Keaton, she said formally, loud enough for her parents to hear. I truly apologize for the distress I have caused you and your family. I will ensure all arrangements are cancelled immediately. She followed him into the hall, and only when they were entirely out of her mother's sight did she lean close, her voice dropping to an urgent, fierce whisper meant for his ears alone. I am doing this to save a life, Jonathan, she said, her eyes boring into his, the tranquil surface finally breaking to reveal the desperation beneath. You saw her last night. I will take the dishonor, but you must take the responsibility for what comes next. You will know how to honor it. She stepped back, her duty fulfilled. She had given him the cryptic truth he needed, the acknowledgement that her sacrifice was not for her phantom lover, but for the fragile life he nearly lost. She had placed the burden of love and conscience squarely back on his honorable shoulders, and now he had the freedom to choose how he would proceed. The engagement was broken. The life, perhaps, was saved. 3 months passed over the Morland estate, 3 months of heavy silence and profound change. The gossip surrounding Catherine's abrupt and scandalous breakup with Jonathan Keaton had finally softened into weary acceptance. Evelyn, though still mourning the loss of the advantageous match, had poured her energy into marrying off other, less connected young women, leaving her own household relatively unmolested. Catherine herself had retreated slightly from society, bearing the dishonor with a quiet, impenetrable dignity. Lydia, shielded by her sister's sacrifice, began the slow, halting journey toward recovery. The immediate threat of the wedding was gone, and with it, the suffocating weight of her guilt began to lift. The color returned gradually to her cheeks, the tremors ceased, and the terror in her chest subsided. She was weak, certainly, but she was alive, the forced duty having been replaced by an overwhelming, confusing gratitude toward Catherine, whose motives she was not yet brave enough to ask about. She knew only that her sister had saved her, and that Jonathan was gone. Or so she thought. One crisp afternoon in late autumn, Jonathan Keaton called. He did not arrive with the formality of a suitor, or even the propriety of a former fiancé seeking closure. He arrived as a friend of the family, a term that was entirely inaccurate but which Evelyn, weary of scandal, allowed to pass. Lydia found him in the small morning parlour, a room rarely used and blessedly free of her mother's supervision. He rose immediately when she entered, looking healthier, yet still carrying the quiet burden of honour that always marked him. "Miss Morland," he greeted her, his voice low. "Mr. Keaton," she replied, her heart fluttering nervously, but not with the sharp agony of guilt. It was a quieter, softer tremor of confusion. They spoke first of Catherine. Jonathan confirmed that he held no ill will. He respected her decision, he said, and wished her happiness with her new path. The lie hung delicately between them, the phantom scholar giving them the necessary cover. Then, the conversation drifted toward the unspoken, toward the reason they were truly sitting across from each other. "You are looking much better, Miss Morland," Jonathan observed, his gaze lingering with a profound seriousness that made her look down at her hands. "I was gravely concerned for your health at the ball." Lydia gripped her hands together. "I apologize again for the scene I caused. It was inexcusable." "It was entirely excusable," Jonathan countered quietly, surprising her with his firmness. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to the intimacy of the library conversation months before. "Lydia, there is a certain kind of suffering that cannot be contained by courtesy, a suffering that becomes physical when the soul cannot bear the pressure of a lie." He used her Christian name, a small but devastating shift in decorum. She finally raised her eyes, meeting his gaze. "I have spoken often with Catherine since the separation," he continued, carefully omitting the fact that those conversations had been one-sided, a mental debate with his own conscience after reading her cryptic goodbye. "I understand her decision completely, and I respect it more than any agreement we could have signed. She acted on a profound truth, and that truth was essential to the well-being of someone she loved." He paused, letting the full, weighted significance of his words settle upon her. He was not naming the person Catherine loved or the life she saved, but the reference was clear, unmistakable. He was telling her he understood the sacrifice, he understood the love. "She gave a remarkable gift, Lydia," he finished, his voice hushed with reverence. "A life-giving gift. It is one we must both honor." Lydia could only whisper the raw, unpolished word that had haunted her for 3 months. "Duty?" "No," he said, meeting her eyes with a quiet resolve. "Hope." He did not confess his love that day, or rush to claim the prize Catherine had so painfully delivered. Jonathan called again a week later, and then again, slowly, quietly, as a friend of the family, and then as something more hesitant and profound. Their relationship begins not with the fleeting passion of a stolen moment, but with the foundation of profound, shared respect and the quiet, enduring knowledge that their love was a costly, hard-won gift. They were forever bound by the debt owed to Catherine's ultimate, selfless act of sibling devotion, choosing a hesitant beginning over a lifelong heartbreak. The end.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. so do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.